Okay, in this next video in the nutrition series, we're going to tackle carbohydrates. Probably one of the most hot button nutrients out there because especially in the last few years, every diet has been hyper focused on carbohydrate intake, going back from the Atkins diet, which seems like 100 years ago, to more recently the paleo and ketogenic diets, which are generally very low carb. There's a misconception that carbohydrates automatically make people fat. That is a myth. Carbohydrates are just like protein and fat. Depending on how many you eat, it will have an impact on your weight and performance, but just eating carbohydrates doesn't automatically make somebody overweight. And there's a lot of zealots out there that are very on board with the Atkins or the keto diet and paleo diet, and they act like carbohydrates are the enemy and they do nothing but bad things, but that's totally not true. Your body uses those carbohydrates for fuel. Your brain especially. Your brain actually, so imagine you eat a baked potato. The baked potato gets broken down into your bloodstream into what's called glucose. That glucose is used by your muscles to do work. So especially high intensity work, if you're gonna go on like a sprint, your muscles need those carbohydrates in the way of glycogen or glucose to do the work. Your brain is the biggest user of glucose because your brain is the biggest user of blood. It takes a lot of blood, oxygen, and glucose to power this thing in our skull. So when you're very carbohydrate deprived, because maybe somebody's on a diet that's very carbohydrate restricted, or for whatever reason, your mental faculties are going to be one of the first things that you notice and being a little off. You're going to be very tired. Fatigue is definitely one. Maybe like a little cloudy headed. And this is because your brain is basically starving for this fuel. Now, the popularity of the ketogenic diet tries to teach people there's a way around that. If you go long enough, very restricted in carbohydrates, your body, your brain especially, will eventually shift into ketosis, which there's a backup fuel source for your brain called ketones. And that's basically when your brain's like, okay, I see we're not getting enough glucose to do work. Let's go ahead and use this backup source because we need to do work. We got to keep this human being alive and moving. So ketones are like the body's, backup generator. When there's not enough carbohydrates, it'll switch to ketones. And the reason that's popular in the ketogenic diet is because people think that if you shift into that, you'll be more likely to burn fat as fuel because there's no carbohydrates for your body to use, so your body will start to use its own fat source. I'm not going to get into that because it's a long discussion. Maybe I'll cover that in a different topic. But just know that it's really it's a self-preservation method that your brain uses. It's not ideal. Your brain and body would much prefer to use carbohydrates in the way of glucose to do all the things it needs to do. So carbohydrates by themselves are obviously not bad. The problem is we tend to overeat them because carbohydrates are also in some of the most yummiest foods and also the most highly processed. French fries, potato chips, basically all the delicious snack food you can think of are going to be high in carbohydrates. So we end up overeating them very easily because there's really not a mechanism in our brain that says, hey, you've eaten enough carbohydrates, especially the processed foods, because they're engineered to be eaten very fast and not be very filling. So you can plow through a bag of chips and you kind of feel pretty full afterwards, but it's not the same thing as if you'd eaten like a lot of steak. You're going to be super full because there's different signals coming from your stomach and your gut to your brain that really aren't triggered as much. Plus, there's a lot of complex chemistry going on when it comes to carbohydrate intake. Now, just like with the protein method, you can actually use your palm to measure, or your hand to measure the appropriate amount of carbohydrates. Generally, one serving of carbohydrates that's appropriate is going to be a cupped handful. Again, your hand size is going to be dependent on your body size. So if you have a very large hand, you're going to have more carbohydrates. Now, guys, we can usually do about two cupped handfuls of carbohydrates per meal, and that's again assuming you're eating 3 to 4 times a day. Ladies, again, 1 cupped handful of carbohydrates per meal, 3 to 4 times a day. And if you look, that's not really a lot. Like most people, when they go to eat Italian food, they'll get a bowl of pasta, and that's probably more like 5 or 6 or 7 servings of carbohydrates. So yeah, in that case, you are going to gain weight because you're eating way too much. But if you actually are able to stick to this 1 to 2 cupped handfuls, you'll be okay. The other tricky thing with carbohydrates that kind of throws people off is that when you take in a lot of carbohydrates, well, carbohydrates make you retain fluid. So for every gram of carbohydrate, you'll hold on to about 3 to 4 grams of fluid. So what that means is, say, hypothetically, you ate 100 grams of carbohydrates, which isn't really that much. If you look on like a chip bag, it's probably, maybe 2 servings. That 100 grams of carbohydrates is going to make you also hold on to 300 to 400 grams of water. That doesn't sound like a lot, but over, spread out over your body, that can start to equal a couple of pounds or more of just fluid retention. So when somebody eats a very high carbohydrate meal, like you're eating a pasta or something, you're not just taking in those carbohydrates, you're also holding on to a lot more water. So that's why if you, maybe you get on the scale the next day after you eat a pizza or a high carb meal, you notice like, whoa, I've gained 4 pounds. How did that happen? Well, you didn't eat 4 pounds of food, you didn't gain 4 pounds of fat. You most likely probably just held on to about 3 to 3.5 pounds of fluid. So it's shocking when you look at the scale and you see a big jump, but just know that that fluid eventually will disperse from your body. You're going to, expel it in sweat or through your breath or, urine, whatever. So that's not fat that's going to stick on your body. It's probably going to be out of your system pretty quickly. But that's why a lot of people, when they go on a very low carb diet, they see very fast weight loss. It's not because you just burned through a lot of body fat very fast, maybe a little bit, but more likely you just dropped a whole lot of fluid weight. And so it's reassuring when you see that on a scale, like, oh yeah, I dropped 5 pounds, that's cool. But just know that it's not because of, this, you're burning through body fat, you're just not holding on to enough water. So that's the big thing that people get confused when it comes to carbohydrates. They think that you have to cut a lot of carbs and it equals fast weight loss. Yes, but it's not fast fat loss, it's fast water loss. So that's not what most people are looking for. So again, 1 to 2 cupped handfuls of carbohydrates, that's 1 serving, assuming you're eating 3 to 4 times a day for men. Women, 1 cupped handful. So get used to trying to eyeball that, if it's rice or potato, whatever, prefer whole foods versus snack foods, obviously. But just think, however many you can fit in your palm, that's 1 serving. All right, hopefully that's helpful. Take care, y'all.